The year was 1910, and Mexico was about to explode. For 34 years, Porfirio Diaz had ruled Mexico as a dictator. While a small elite class grew fabulously wealthy, most Mexicans, especially rural farmers and indigenous peoples, lived in desperate poverty. Then, Francisco Madero, a reform-minded politician, challenged Diaz in what was supposed to be an election. When Diaz stole the election and threw Madero in jail, Madero's supporters called for revolution. What followed was 10 years of chaos, violence, and bloodshed that would become known as the Mexican Revolution. And it sent nearly 10% of Mexico's entire population fleeing north, many through the port of Galveston and across the Texas border. To understand why so many Mexicans fled during this period, you need to understand what the revolution was like for ordinary people. Imagine armed soldiers arriving in your village and announcing that every man between 15 and 40 must join the army, right now, today, no exceptions. You have no choice which side you fight for. You simply become a soldier for whichever faction controls your area. If you refuse, you might be shot as a traitor. This happened constantly during the revolution. Both government forces and various revolutionary factions desperately needed soldiers, so they simply forced men into service. Families faced an impossible choice. Watch your husband, father, or son march away to almost certain death, or flee. The revolution wasn't fought on distant battlefields. It came to people's homes. Revolutionary armies and government troops moved through towns and villages, demanding food, animals, and supplies. If you couldn't or wouldn't provide them, your property might be burned. Women faced assault. Homes were ransacked. Crops were destroyed. Sometimes the violence was even more targeted. If your family was suspected of supporting the wrong side, you might be executed as an example. Entire villages suspected of harboring revolutionaries were sometimes destroyed. Even if your village avoided direct violence, the revolution destroyed the economy. Farms couldn't operate because men were conscripted and fields became battlegrounds. Money became worthless due to inflation. Banks collapsed. Normal trade stopped functioning. For people already living on the edge of survival, this economic chaos meant starvation. Perhaps worst of all was the uncertainty. The revolution kept changing. New leaders emerged, alliances shifted, and fighting continued year after year after year. From 1910 to 1920, there was no safe haven, no stable government, no way to know when or if it would ever end. Mexican refugees fleeing the revolution came to Texas in several ways. Most crossed at border towns like El Paso, Laredo, or Brownsville. Families packed what they could carry and walked across the Rio Grande. Some had relatives in Texas who could help them. Others knew no one and had nowhere to go, but anywhere seemed safer than staying in Mexico. The railroad system, though disrupted by the fighting, sometimes still operated. Refugees who could afford tickets or who risked riding atop train cars made their way to border towns and then crossed into Texas. Some refugees, particularly from Gulf Coast states like Veracruz and Tamaulipas, boarded ships to Galveston. This was more expensive than crossing the land border, but it was often faster and safer, especially for families with small children. When Mexican refugees arrived at Galveston's port, they faced the same quarantine and inspection procedures as European immigrants, but with an added complication: racial prejudice. Mexican immigrants, unlike European immigrants, were clearly non-white in the eyes of the segregated South. This meant they faced discrimination from the moment they arrived. Despite the prejudice, Texas offered something Mexico couldn't during the Revolution: jobs, and relative safety. Galveston's port and Houston's rapidly growing shipping industry needed laborers. Someone had to load and unload ships, maintain rail lines, and perform the back-breaking physical work that kept commerce moving. Mexican immigrants, desperate for any employment, took these jobs even though they were dangerous, poorly paid, and offered no security. Texas cities were growing rapidly in the early 20th century. Mexican workers helped build roads, buildings, and infrastructure. They often worked for less money than Anglo workers demanded, which made them attractive to employers, but also created tension with established workers who saw Mexicans as competition. Mexican women found work as housekeepers, cooks, and laundresses in Anglo households. This work was poorly paid, but at least provided steady employment and sometimes housing. Many refugees ended up as migrant farm workers, following harvests across Texas and the Southwest. This work was seasonal, insecure, and exhausting, but it was available. Mexican immigrants quickly discovered that they weren't welcome in most Anglo neighborhoods. Whether through explicit housing restrictions or hostile neighbors, they were pushed into separate communities. So they created their own. These neighborhoods became known as barrios, the Spanish word for neighborhood, but with a specific meaning. Communities within cities where Mexican culture, language, and traditions could be maintained. In Galveston, Mexican immigrants settled primarily in the East End, often in alley houses, small dwellings built in the alleys behind larger homes on main streets. These houses were cramped and lacked amenities, but they were affordable and created a tight-knit community. The heart of Galveston's Mexican community became a small cafe called La Paloma, the Dove, though Anglos knew it as the Dove Chili Parlor. Founded in 1932 by Manuel and Modesta Ramirez, La Paloma was more than just a restaurant. It was a place where Spanish was the language spoken, Mexican immigrants could get news from home, traditional foods reminded people of what they'd left behind, the community could gather for celebrations and support each other during hard times. New arrivals could find information about jobs and housing. La Paloma represented what sociologists call a community anchor, a gathering place that helps maintain cultural identity and provides practical support. Perhaps the most famous Mexican immigrant community in Texas was Magnolia Park in Houston, known simply as Little Mexico. Magnolia Park started as a camp for railroad workers near the Houston Ship Channel. As more Mexican refugees arrived, it grew into a full neighborhood. By the 1920s, it had thousands of Mexican residents, its own businesses, churches, and schools, a distinctive cultural identity, close-knit family networks. The community was anchored by organizations like the Sociedad Mutualista Benito Juárez Mutual Aid Society, named after Mexico's revered indigenous president. Like the Italian Mutual Aid Society or the Czech SPJST, these mutualistas provided burial insurance, ensuring a dignified funeral, small loans for emergencies, a social space for community gatherings, political organizing, and advocacy. The mutualistas were crucial because Mexican immigrants faced systematic discrimination. They couldn't count on Anglo institutions for help, so they built their own support systems. Dallas also developed a Little Mexico neighborhood, interestingly in an area that had previously been a Jewish neighborhood. As earlier Jewish residents moved to other parts of the city, Mexican immigrants moved in. Pike Park became the heart of this community. This public park was where children played baseball and soccer. Families gathered for Diez y Seis, September 16th, Mexican Independence Day celebrations. Community meetings were held. Musicians performed traditional Mexican music. Parks were particularly important for immigrant communities because they were public spaces where people could gather freely without paying admission or facing the discrimination they might encounter in Anglo-owned businesses. Mexican immigrants arrived in Texas during the height of the Jim Crow era, when racial segregation was legally enforced throughout the South. While segregation was primarily designed to separate black and white Texans, it also affected Mexicans. Segregated schools. Mexican children were often forced to attend separate Mexican schools that were grossly underfunded compared to Anglo schools. These schools had fewer books and supplies, employed less trained teachers, often paid less, focused on Americanization rather than academic achievement, sometimes prohibited speaking Spanish even on the playground, prepared students for manual labor rather than higher education. This educational discrimination had lasting effects, limiting the opportunities available to Mexican American children and perpetuating poverty across generations. Many neighborhoods had deed restrictions explicitly prohibiting sale or rental to Mexicans. Real estate agents refused to show homes in Anglo neighborhoods to Mexican families. Even those who could afford better housing were forced to remain in the barrios. Movie theaters, restaurants, swimming pools, and other public facilities were often segregated. Signs reading "No Mexicans" or "White Trade Only" were common. Some businesses had separate entrances or seating areas for Mexican customers. Mexican workers were typically paid less than Anglos for the same work. They were rarely promoted to supervisory positions. Many professions were effectively closed to them through formal or informal discrimination. Despite these obstacles, Mexican immigrants and their children refused to accept second-class status quietly. Mutualistas as political organizations. The mutual aid societies didn't just provide insurance, they became political organizing spaces. They advocated for better wages and working conditions, improved schools for Mexican children, an end to discriminatory practices, political representation. Mexican workers joined or formed labor unions, sometimes facing violence from employers and police for doing so. They organized strikes and boycotts demanding fair treatment. Rather than abandoning their Mexican identity to try to fit in, many immigrants and their children proudly maintained their language, customs, and traditions. Días y Seis celebrations, quinceañeras, coming-of-age celebrations for girls, and other Mexican cultural practices became more elaborate and public, not less. Despite the poor quality of segregated schools, Mexican families valued education and pushed their children to succeed academically. Parents who were illiterate themselves insisted their children learn to read and write in both Spanish and English. Children born to Mexican immigrants in Texas, the second generation, faced unique challenges. They were Americans by birth, but treated as foreigners. They spoke English as well as or better than Spanish, but were still seen as Mexican by Anglo-Texans. Many second-generation Mexican Americans became cultural bridge builders. They navigated between Mexican and American cultures, translated literally and figuratively for their parents, fought for civil rights and equal treatment, eventually became teachers, business owners, and political leaders. This generation would go on to fuel the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s, demanding full equality and recognition as Americans. The influx of Mexican immigrants during the Revolution years fundamentally changed Texas' demographics. By 1930, Texas had a significant Mexican origin population concentrated in South Texas, along the border, and in urban barrios like those in Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and El Paso. This population brought Mexican music, art, food, and traditions became integral to Texas culture. Today, Tex-Mex cuisine is recognized worldwide. Spanish is widely spoken throughout the state, and Mexican cultural celebrations are mainstream Texas events. Mexican immigrants and their descendants provided essential labor that built Texas's infrastructure, harvested its crops, and fueled its industrial growth. While often exploited and underpaid, their work was indispensable to the state's development. The Mexican origin population became Texas's largest minority group, eventually becoming a major political and economic force in the state. Unlike some states where immigrants were expected to completely abandon their native language, Texas, particularly South Texas and border regions, developed a genuinely bilingual culture where Spanish and English coexisted. The Mexican immigration story differs from the European stories in important ways. Unlike Germans or Poles who crossed an ocean and could never easily return home, Mexican immigrants could potentially go back to Mexico. This meant many maintained stronger ties to their homeland, going back and forth as circumstances allowed. Some always intended to return to Mexico once the revolution ended, though many ended up staying permanently in Texas. While European immigration largely stopped after the quota laws of the 1920s, Mexican immigration continued, though it became more restricted and controlled. This meant Mexican-American communities continuously received new immigrants, keeping cultural traditions fresh, but also creating tension between established Mexican-Americans and new arrivals. European immigrants, despite initial discrimination, eventually became accepted as white Americans. Mexican immigrants and their descendants faced persistent racial discrimination that didn't simply disappear with time or assimilation. The fact that Mexico and Texas shared a border meant that Mexican culture in Texas wasn't purely a memory of a distant homeland. It was a living, evolving culture continuously influenced by proximity to Mexico. By 1920, the worst violence of the Mexican Revolution had ended. But most of the refugees who'd fled to Texas didn't return to Mexico. They'd built lives, had children, established businesses and communities. Texas, despite its discrimination and hardships, had become home. The barrios they created, Little Mexico in Houston, the East End in Galveston, Pike Park in Dallas, became permanent features of the Texas landscape. These weren't temporary refugee camps. They were communities with their own institutions, traditions, and identities. Today, when you drive through cities like San Antonio, Houston, or El Paso, and see neighborhoods where Spanish is the dominant language, where Mexican bakeries and restaurants line the streets, where murals celebrate Mexican and Mexican-American culture, you're seeing the lasting impact of those Revolutionary-era refugees who came through Galveston and across the border, seeking safety and opportunity. Their story reminds us that immigration is rarely just about economics or opportunity. Sometimes it's about survival. Sometimes people don't leave home seeking a better life. They leave because staying means death. And when they arrive, they don't just assimilate and disappear. They build communities, maintain traditions, and change their new home, even as it changes them. The Mexican immigrants who came during the Revolution helped make Texas what it is today, a state where cowboy culture and vaquero traditions blend together, where country music and conjunto music share the radio dial, where both English and Spanish echo through the streets, and where the line between Mexican and Texan has always been wonderfully, complicatedly blurred. Be sure to hit like and subscribe to continue this journey through the Golden Door and find out how other groups immigrated to Texas through Galveston. Let me know in the comments what you think so far, and what other parts of history would you like to see covered. Until next time, stay curious.